So welcome and thank you everybody for joining us for this week's session of the Civics Project on state governments. I'm Beth Ribet and I am the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. Before we get to our primary content on state governments today, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovaangar, the Los Angeles basis in South Channel Islands, which is where we're broadcasting from. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatum, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. As noted, our primary topic today focuses on state governments. Up until now in our sessions with the Civics Project, we've talked almost entirely about government relative to the US federal government. So I want to start with just a little bit of history and talk about the initial states that became part of the United States. The very first state to enter the Union in the United States was Delaware. And it did so on December 7th of 1787 on the authority of its state government. And just within days that month, it was followed by Pennsylvania and by New Jersey's. And then over the next roughly 2.5 years, it was joined by Georgia and Connecticut in January of 1788, and then by Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. Vermont and Kentucky and Tennessee also joined the United States before the advent of the 19th century, so in the late 1790s. The latest of the 50 states to join the Union, as many of you may know, were Hawaii and Alaska. And for both of those states, their entry into the United States was in 1959. The governance of the United States as a nation as a whole reflects a balance and often reflects tensions between the allocation of power and responsibility between the federal government and each state, and can also involve struggle within states over the exercise of power between the state and local governments, local municipalities at the city or county level. We think of power as more centralized when it's vested in one higher authority, like the US federal government, and more decentralized when power is increasingly vested in the states and at the local level, so down to the level of cities and counties. Now, an obvious question, excuse me, an obvious question many of you might ask is, who decides? How do we know which power belongs to the US government and which belongs to the state? And the answer to that question is kind of constantly evolving and frequently contested. But one of the authorities we can look to is the US Constitution. And via the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the language in the Constitution reads specifically, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it, meaning prohibited by the Constitution to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So basically, where the Constitution does not give authority to the United States government, then by default, it goes to the state. And that may sound simpler than it actually is. Sovereignty, the question of who gets to rule, emerges frequently in questions of state independence or submission to the federal government. And then is further complicated because the United States also contains a number of indigenous nations, sometimes referred to as domestic dependent nations, a term the US government has used to describe indigenous peoples who are under the authority of the United States government, but also have their own government. And because the United States has colonized territories, which again include Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. So all of this really complicates the question of who has control, who rules, Is it a state? Is it a territory? And how is power going to be allocated? And probably the most infamous instance of conflict over who maintains power is it the federal government or a state, was a conflict both over slavery as an institution, but also over federal authority to regulate states, and that, of course, was the Civil War. So the Confederate flag became known as the symbol of the war for Southern independence. And as the U.S. South framed its uprising against the federal government, their claim was to assert the need for the rights for individual states to govern themselves, though we know from the historical context that much of what prompted the Civil War was anxiety over the extent to which the federal government would interfere with, disrupt, or potentially eventually abolish the institution of slavery. However, the literal subject or terrain of the conflict was the question of, can states remove themselves from the Union? Can they govern themselves independently of the United States government? And the Confederate flag continues to exist both as a symbol of the desire to maintain slavery and as an assertion of states' rights over the federal government. Let's talk about areas that in large part, and this does not mean entirely, belong to the states to decide. Some of these include property ownership. So how is property owned? How is it sold or given? How is it inherited? Also, marriage and family. How are those structured, managed by state courts, by municipal courts? The administration of social welfare programs, even if the money comes from the state, funding for programs like Social Security and unemployment and Medicare is generally managed by the states. The process of setting up municipalities, so creating and maintaining cities and counties, that's regulated by state governments rather than by the federal government for the most part. Maintaining state infrastructure, and that includes physical infrastructure like highways and transportation, as well as the institutions of the state, its own courts, its own Department of Justice, its own departments of health and human services, and so forth. Regulating industry and commerce within the state is largely, though not entirely, a state process. And educating youth in particular, and also college-level education, is mostly regulated by the states and not the federal government. But in each of these areas, you may have been thinking of examples of instances where the federal government is clearly also exercising authority. So an example, for instance, would be, I mentioned that states manage the delivery of education, but some of you, for instance, have heard of Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in the delivery of education. Federal civil rights legislation can play a role in many of these areas and mean that while the states have substantial authority, they still have to operate in ways that comply with other areas of federal law. The federal government can also influence education because it provides a lot of educational funding through its federal tax base. And so it can establish rules for any state which is seeking federal funding to use in its school systems. And it can do that for non-discrimination reasons, but it can do it for other reasons as well. So some of you might remember from the George W. Bush era, a piece of legislation called No Child Left Behind, which established additional rules that schools would have to follow if they wanted to receive federal funds. For instance, establishing that if too many students were failing standardized tests, then the school would lose some of its federal funding. And it created increased pressure on schools to divert a lot of educational resources to making sure students passed those tests. And one of the perhaps unintended effects of the No Child Left Behind Act is that we started to see schools try to push out, discipline, and expel, in some instances, students with disabilities who were not performing well on standardized tests. So we can see different ways in which the federal government, whether from your perspective helpfully or harmfully, can still interfere or regulate or intervene in areas that are seen as a question of generally state power or state rights. We also have various kinds of federal law governing commerce. So even if state is supposed to regulate industries in its own state, the federal government can have an effect there as well. And for instance, we know that until 2015, states could make individual determinations about whether to allow same-sex marriage, but the US Supreme Court ultimately legalized same-sex marriage using the US Constitution in its decision in Obergefell versus Hodges. So there are different ways in which even when something is considered an area of state control or state power, the federal government may also be exercising authority. And as you can imagine, state governments and the federal governments can get into arguments, disagreements, or outright conflict. I'm not talking about armed conflict like the Civil War, but conflict in public rhetoric, in the media, and conflict in the courts over how power is going to be allocated and how decisions will be made. So I mentioned same-sex marriage. Some other controversial areas where we've seen visible conflicts between state and federal authority. One is the legalization of marijuana. So this has been, and sometimes other drugs as well. So this has been an obvious area of conflict. California was one of the early states to legalize medical marijuana. And as the most populated state, obviously it had a significant effect. And one of the things that the state did was pass by voter proposition, right, a process of legalizing marijuana. The state established regulation, taxed facilities, and allowed marijuana from pharmacies or clubs to essentially form, as well as regulating medical marijuana growers. At the same time, at the federal level, either the possession, the growing, or the distribution or sale of marijuana remained a federal crime. So the state of California was saying this is legal, at least for medical purposes under certain conditions. And the federal government was saying, no, it's not. And so early on, after the passage of medical marijuana legislation in California, you would sometimes see businesses that had been set up to distribute medical marijuana being raided by agents of the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency. They would confiscate property. In some instances, they made arrests or established fines. And so you would see this obvious conflict between businesses that were operating legally under state law and illegally under federal law. And the state of California did not respond by saying, oops, our bad, we'll stop treating marijuana as a legal institution. The state and federal government continue to be in conflict over this question. Now, DEA raids of state-regulated marijuana facilities have essentially died down, but this still remains an area which is in flux between federal and state law. Let's look at a few other examples. Sanctuary cities. How many of you know those terms? I'll ask our Zoom audience. Some of you are going, oh yeah, I've heard of sanctuary cities. So sanctuary city is a city that makes a localized determination. It's not generally for the whole state. It's a city deciding we are not going to enable the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division. And they can do that a number of ways without outright violating the law. And then some sanctuary cities have engaged in actions which the cities assert are legal and the federal government will assert is not. So let's think about some concrete examples. One of the common things that a sanctuary city says is we will not volunteer information. We will not share information with ICE unless compelled to by a court. And the question of does a state have any obligation to help a federal law enforcement entity is an interesting one, and one in which different court decisions have weighed in different directions. So this is basically what we would think of as a gray area or an area of ambiguity in federal and state law. Do state entities have an obligation to help federal institutions absent an explicit federal statute which says they have to, for instance. Can federal entities get access to people, to records, and so forth? So what we've seen play out in sanctuary cities is the question of, will state authorities transfer custody of a person over to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement if that person is in the custody of the state, and if so, under what circumstances? And who decides that? Is it a federal court or a state court or a municipal court? And I don't have a simple answer for you about who controls it, because it's actually been, as noted, in an area of evolving conflict where sometimes the federal courts have ordered and the states have complied that the states cooperate in handing over people or information. And in other instances, state courts have said you don't have to, and the federal court has either backed off, or the federal government has backed off, or they've insisted but the state has not complied. So sanctuary cities, again, remain this area of open conflict and continue to be, although I would anticipate that the escalation of it is going to recede under the Biden administration as compared to the Trump administration. In the last 4 years, in the past presidential administration, the question of whether states would comply with federal authority in sanctuary cities was an area of grave contention. Right? This was coming up a lot and was winding up in state and federal court a fair bit as well. I want to talk about another area for conflict between state and federal authority. Voting rights is another significant area in which this comes into play, historically and in contemporary context. So states historically started to allow, for instance, women to vote in certain states before they had any guaranteed federal right to vote. So some states did so, some states did not, until 1919, when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution provided that suffrage, the right to vote, was afforded to women across all of the United States. Once the 19th Amendment passed, it took the question of whether to allow someone to vote based on their gender away from state power by making it a guaranteed right under the Constitution. Remember again that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution indicates that if it's not either prohibited to the states or provided to the federal government, then it's up to the states for the most part, right? And so once it became a question of constitutional authority, then the states had no control over whether they could prohibit women to vote. It became a guaranteed federal right. But voting rights based on race and sometimes other characteristics, like for instance being formerly incarcerated or having a mental disability, have continued to be an area of contention. I'll say race right now is by far the most energetic area of contention, but others have come up in various moments in time and questions of voting rights and disability do continue to be a contemporary issue in the United States. So one of the things that we have seen is that the question of, do states get to set their own laws if they have discriminatory effects for voters of color, is an area of contention between the state and federal government. Now, some of you may have heard about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which again took some authority away from the states to use discriminatory practices in voting. And under congressional authority, provided for certain protections for voters who are typically being disenfranchised, meaning losing the vote. And just to avoid euphemisms or dancing around the issue, of course, this meant specifically voters of color and very disproportionately Black and Indigenous and Latinx voters. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 took away some power from states which wanted to maintain discriminatory, or what we think of as Jim Crow era voting practices. But subsequent court decisions, and we'll talk more about those in later sessions, took some of that power back for the states. And we see Congress right now debating establishing voting rights, voting rights legislation at the federal level. And we see states passing new voting rights or voting or elections legislation, which would further inhibit access to the vote. So voting is another one. Abortion and reproduction are another common, very visible area of conflict between state and federal government. Until the passage of Roe versus Wade, some states criminalized abortion. The Roe versus Wade case was grounded in a Texas criminal law, which would prosecute a woman or a doctor who engaged in abortion. And what the Supreme Court was deciding on was, in Roe versus Wade, was did that law violate the U.S. Constitution? And by finding that it did, because the Supreme Court has so much influence, it had the impact of basically overriding any state law, which was interfering to the extent that the Texas criminal statute did with a woman's access to abortion. Now, there's still some things that states can regulate, for instance, about licensing, and there are continuing legal contentions and debates about what powers belong to the state and what can be taken back and decided by the courts. When ex-President Trump took office, the very first media interview he gave was one in which he indicated he intended to weight the Supreme Court justices heavily enough that they would overturn Roe versus Wade, with the intention of then returning control over the regulation of abortion back to the states. And since he has put in enough Supreme Court justices to constitute not just a majority, but a supermajority, 6 to 9, are now likely to vote to some extent against abortion rights based on their track record, this will likely become a very major issue of contention. In other words, if the Supreme Court decides that abortion is no longer protected under the U.S. Constitution, it will become a question of state determination, and we can see individual states potentially criminalizing abortion again. So some of these examples should illustrate to you that state exercises of independence can swing to the left or the right, depending on the context. And we can think about this in the Trump era. We can think about it now under the new presidential administrations as we see conflict over voting rights. And depending on your own politics, right, you may have different takes on particular questions of state versus federal authority. In other words, depending on the issue is. For instance, progressive voters are likely to be in favor of sanctuary cities, but to want to maintain constitutional protection for reproductive choice or reproductive rights. And so it's not as simple as sort of states' rights arguments belonging to the left or the right? Because again, in a given moment, some states may be defying federal authority or asserting their own independence on either a left or a right-wing issue. I want to say a little bit more about how state governments run and what they do. So each state government can establish its own constitution, and it roughly mirrors the structure of the federal constitution, though they can be much more detailed and longer. I believe Alabama has the largest state constitution in the country, and it's over 300 pages, as opposed to the U.S. Constitution, which, as I recall, is less than 40. I think it's 39 pages. And state constitutions like the federal one can have a process for amendments, and each state constitution establishes its own process by which it can then be changed. And some state constitutions have just a few amendments, and some have dozens or even more than 100 of them. So at least as I recall, I don't have the data in front of me. But states get a lot of control over their own rules. Basically, state governments can pass constitutional regulations or provisions as long as they do not violate the federal Constitution or other powers allocated to the federal government by the Constitution. So when we see a conflict between state and federal law, one of the things that we see is that the Constitution has given Congress some power to make certain kinds of federal laws. And when they exist, as long as they don't abridge or interfere with a protected right of the states, right, then states will have to follow those federal laws, but they can add. So for instance, we have as a baseline civil rights instrument in the United States, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on a number of bases like race, religion, and eventually sex or gender. We also have companion civil rights instruments such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, the Rehabilitation Act, right? So we have different areas or different instruments that make up our federal laws. States are not allowed to just override that regulation. So a state, for instance, can't declare, we will not allow compliance or enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act in our state. We will ignore the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But state entities under some of these acts have some immunities, so they get to decide from themselves whether they comply with some areas of civil rights instruments within their own institutions, like a state school or the state government itself. And states can also pass state civil rights laws which add more protection than the federal government provides. So as an example, a state, for instance, so the federal government would say, okay, an employer is subject to a civil rights instrument, let's say if they have 40 employees. And an individual state would say, well, we're going to lower that. We will say, we will allow an employer to be subject to our state civil rights entities. And actually, the number I gave you isn't actually accurate. State federal civil rights law generally kick in if an employer has at least 15 employees. So a state could say, well, we think smaller employers should be covered. We'll say 10. And then a municipality could say, well, we're going to make it even smaller. So for instance, New York City has its own civil rights ordinances or statutes, as we think of them, provisions, and it applies to employers as long as they employ at least 4 people. The federal government passed the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA, and it gives you a right to take 12 weeks of unpaid leave without losing your benefits or your right to come back to your job, provided you're an employee and your employer is covered under the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. But it doesn't pay for that time off. And one of the things that we find is that many people in the United States, even if you've got a right to take 12 weeks off of work, either to be ill or to take care of a family member that's ill, or to have a baby, or to adopt a child and bond with that child. You may have a right to not lose your job, but many people can't afford roughly 3 months of work to be unpaid. So states can opt to pay for that time off, and a minority of states do so. For instance, my state, California, has a state statute which says we will pay you to take disability leave or to take family or caregiver leave at a certain rate for a certain number of time, for a certain amount of time. It's generally going to be less than your regular wages, but something like state unemployment, it will pay for you to have that leave for a portion of time. So it picks up where the federal law gives off. where the federal law leaves off. So the federal law protects you from discrimination by your employer if you need to have a baby, or you get sick, or you have to care for an immediate family member who's sick. But the state law can say not only is all that true, but we're going to pay for it. So a lot of times what state legislatures, state governments are faced with is, how do we want to add to the protections or resources available to people at the federal level? What do we want to regulate? Do we just let existing federal law or constitutional law be the default? Or do we make more rules, establish more rights, or create more protections or penalties at the state level? States also have their own court systems, and state courts in each state will have their own Supreme Court, their own courts of appeals, and their own municipal courts. State gets to decide what's decided at the level of a local or superior court. When does something need to go up to a higher level? States can decide, are judges in its state system elected or appointed? And states do a variety of things in that regard. States can decide how many Supreme Court justices they have, how long they serve, and what rules or ethics they're expected to follow. So states get control over all of these things. And states also have a lot of control over how they structure elections, as long as they comply with the Constitution, for instance, not taking away rights to vote from women or people of color, and with federal legislation created to protect those constitutional rights, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or the Help America Vote Act, which established a lot of protections for voters with disabilities. But much else is determined at the state level. For instance, states can determine whether voters are allowed, or their voters can determine sometimes whether voters can directly pass legislation through state propositions or ballot measures. States can also determine which powers belong to the state government and which to the municipality. For instance, one area of contention has been over whether cities can establish their own rent control, or whether control over that vests in state governments. Some states have said to cities, you are not allowed to create renters protection. That can only happen at the state level. Other states have left it up to cities to create their own protections where rent prices are going out of control. Similarly, some states regulate their state minimum wage and indicate that municipalities can't change it. Others will allow a city or county to establish a local minimum wage within their city or county that's higher than the state and federal minimum wage. So what we see is that state governments have a lot of ability to fill in all of the open areas that haven't already been controlled by the federal government, including the federal courts. And then there'll be areas of conflict or contention. But many areas remain uncontested. When a citizen feels like a state government is doing a wrong, one of the things that they can do is try to figure out, is the state government either violating its own laws, right? Or is the way that the state is doing something, its policy, its practice, or its law, violating a federal protection, whether under the U.S. Constitution or via legislation created by Congress? And we see those conflicts play out in federal courts. The federal courts always have jurisdiction or control over questions about federal law, unless the question at stake is only, has a state violated its own laws? And if so, that question might be heard in a state court. So states get to basically contour a lot of the things that are significant in our everyday lives. But we pay a lot less attention generally in the United States to state government. Most people, when you ask, can name their senators. Well, I shouldn't say most. Many people, when you ask, can name their federal senators. When you ask people to name their local representatives, their local senators or assembly members, most people don't know who they are. Even if they did vote, they don't remember the names. Most people can't name any Supreme Court justices within their state. Generally, people will know who their governor is, but at a lower rate than people know who the president is. So even though the state has a lot of control over governing the lives of everyday citizens, the level of civic illiteracy, the degree to which we don't know what's going on in our states, is very high among Americans. So that's going to conclude my remarks for today. I just want to close by sharing a book recommendation. And the title of the book is Sanctuary Cities, The Politics of Refuge by Lauren Collingwood and Benjamin Gonzalez O'Brien. Again, that title is Sanctuary Cities, The Politics of Refuge by Lauren Collingwood and Benjamin Gonzalez O'Brien. And for those of our Zoom users, I'll put that question in the chat. I also want to respond to a question from one of our Zoom entities, which is who determines state tax versus federal tax? So the federal taxes are determined by the U.S. Congress and regulated by the Internal Revenue Service. The state taxes are determined by the state government through its own entities. So for the most part, unless it were to abridge on some area of federal law, federal governments stay out of the question of state taxes. The last thing that I want to cover before we end our recording for today is our weekly trivia and announcements about our coming events in April. And I'm going to go ahead and start with our 3 trivia questions for today. And the first is just about the states themselves. I'm going to ask, what's the smallest state in the United States by population? And that's by population, not geography. And your choices are A, Wyoming, B, Vermont, C, Alaska, and D, South Dakota. And the correct answer on this one is Wyoming, which has under 600,000 people. I compare that to my home county of Los Angeles, which has about 11 million people, just the county, and my state, which is closing on about 40 million people. So Wyoming by population is the smallest state in the union with under 600,000 current residents. Which of the following is not commonly covered or not a common element of a state constitution? The powers of the state, the process for amendment, rules for municipal elections, civil rights, or a Bill of Rights. Now, I want to stress that you might find an exception. So I'm asking which is commonly not covered. There might be a state in which all of these things would be present. Again, the choices are A, powers of the state, B, the process for amendment, C, the rules for municipal elections, and D, civil rights or a Bill of Rights. And the correct answer on this is C, rules for municipal elections. Typically, these are more likely to be set out by a state legislature, though you can sometimes find some constitutional rules in some states about it. But virtually, if not all states, will indicate in their state constitution what the powers of the state are, what the process is for amending the Constitution, and what civil rights or Bill of Rights is accorded to the people living in that state. What is the lowest number of state Supreme Court justices in any contemporary U.S. state? And the choices are 3, 4, 5, and 7. So what's the lowest number of Supreme Court justices in a contemporary U.S. state? And the correct answer on this is also C, it's 5. So we do have states that match the federal level and have 9. We've got some with 7, but the least we see in a number of states, not just one, is 5. Just a little bit more information about state Supreme Court justices. Sometimes the state Supreme Courts have been path-making or moving ahead in certain ways before the federal level did. For instance, South Carolina had its first Black Supreme Court justice just after the Civil War in 1870. And that's in contrast to the United States Supreme Court, which did not appoint a Black Supreme Court justice until the appointment of Thurgood Marshall in 1967, 97 years later. Although I should say after that one lone Supreme Court justice in South Carolina, we didn't start to see Black Supreme Court justices again, or any Supreme Court justices of color, until the 20th century, in fact, until about the 1950s. Some state Supreme Courts have still completely failed to diversify, meaning they have not had people of color among their justices, or have never had a Black Supreme Court justice. I believe Delaware just got its first Black Supreme Court justice about 2 years ago. Right. So one of the things that we see is that the states can be both more or less, progressive or inclusive than the federal. So I just want to, for our Zoom users, share some additional resources for learning, and I'll put those in the chat. And I want to invite everybody to join us next week. The registration link just went live for our next session on voting rights. And so I'm putting that link in the chat for our Zoom users, and you will find it accompanying the podcast for those of you listening after, and we should have the rest of our April schedule up soon. I also want to invite everybody to join us for a monthly film screening, which is on the last Wednesday of every month. And this month is on this Wednesday, March 31st at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern time. We will be screening the film Lake of Betrayal, which focuses on U.S. government betrayals of its treaty obligations to the Seneca Nation, the Seneca people. And we'll be joined by Dr. Mashana Goman of the Tonawanda Band of Seneca for commentary afterwards. So that's this Wednesday at 4 o'clock Pacific time for Lake of Betrayal. And I've put that link in the chat as well for our Zoom users. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for the recording today. And Zoom users, please stick around if you would like to for some further discussion.